welcome to the Vrije Universiteit Brussel, to the Universidad Libre de Bruselas, to this, on behalf of the Belgian branch of the International Law Association and the chair Asia Pacific Studies of this same university. We were very welcome, Professor Ernesto Domínguez López and Professora Seida Barrera Rodríguez. Welcome to Brussels, welcome to the University of Brussels. We are very honored and very pleased to have you here today. As you know, we will do one single lecture together, and the core of the topic, as you can see online, is the US policy towards Cuba in the post-Cold War eras. More specifically, the sanctions as a weapon of choice. I will not, as you can see in the screen, Professor Domínguez López and Professora Barrera Rodríguez are both related to the Universidad de Havana, where they are fellowships and they do research. So I will not mention, they have a very impressive curriculum, both of you. So with no further delay, I will give the floor to you. I don't know, it's up to you. You, Professor Domínguez López, you want to start, and then we will move forward in both sides.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Sorry if at some point you can not understand me very well. Actually, both of us, because we're a little bit affected, our voices. But okay, we're gonna do as well as we can. So the topic at hand is a topic that is very important for Cuba in particular, for the Western Hemisphere at large, and I will argue that it's important also to understand the international relations, at least for the last 50, 60 years. And it's a topic that cannot be understood without going into a number of different dimensions, because it's not a simple one. Quite often in media, Cuba is portrayed as an evil dictatorship. It is portrayed as a member of the axis of evil, etc., which largely comes from the way in which it is presented by the United States as a way to somehow justify a type of policy that have been in place for a few decades now. So I think that we first need to go through a number of different aspects and dimensions just to understand the core of our presentation, which is the sanctions themselves. We're going to be talking about the geopolitics of the relation between Cuba and the United States, which is a major factor in explaining the nature of that policy. Then we're going to have a discussion about what we call in Cuba the blockade, and in the US is called embargo. There is even a discussion about the definition itself. And then we're going to go specifically on the factors, meaning the variables that are driving the development, the making and the development of that policy, of those policies for the last 25, 30 years, specifically those years. And then we're going to go into the way in which these sanctions come to be, and very quickly on the impact those sanctions have. So the geopolitical relation, that is a very fundamental component when we are talking about the geopolitics of the relation between Cuba and the United States, which is the nature of the American national project. I can put in just a simple expression: empire building. There is a discussion if the US is an empire or not. They quite often, politicians and academics in the US, they refuse to accept that the US have built an empire. But when we look at history, I think it's quite evident. They have been building a power by expanding territorially first, and then expanding its influence beyond its borders. Not a traditional colonial empire, but the most modern form of empire, in which influence have many different ways of being built and being exercised. Mostly economic, but also other tools like the threat of military action, or strictly speaking, military action. And of course, in the case of the United States, having also the idea of building international institutions and also controlling the narratives in media and all the cultural industries. around the world. But applying the ideas of realpolitik, for example, for a power to be so, it needs to secure a perimeter of needs to create a perimeter of security, what is called national security, which is, in the case of a country like the United States, is not limited to the safety of its citizens and territory. It has to do largely with its interest, like in any other major power around the world at any given time in history. So in that case, for the United States to build this perimeter is extremely important. And on the Cuban side, the national project is to build an independent sovereign state. That's been the national project since the idea of nationhood came to be in the Cuban case, which is happened in the 1800s, in the aftermath of the independence process in Latin America and before Cuban independence. So from that point of view, we can then address the geopolitical value of Cuba. To do so, we just need to look at the map. When you look at the map, and I actually like this map a lot, Cuba is located at the very center of extremely important region, the Great Caribbean Basin, which is a fundamental place due to, first of all, we are very near the southern coast of the United States, at the entrance of the Gulf of Mexico, so anything that comes in and out that particular region needs to cross near Cuba. And also to the south, there is the very important Panama Canal. And if we look at in a broader picture, this is international trading goods, which is mostly by sea. And these are the main routes for that international trading goods. As you can see, Cuba is surrounded by a very dense network of these routes, and is also surrounded by a number of what they are called the choke points of that network, meaning points that if obstructed in some way, the whole network may collapse. I always remember what happened actually recently with the Suez Canal that was blocked for a few days, and supply chains were disrupted, and that created a major problem. So just thinking about those, considering the presence of the United States nearby, and this economic component, we can see that Cuba itself is in a very important position vis-a-vis the development of the United States as a major power. And these have been present since day one, because even before the independence of the United States, some of the founding fathers had already expressed the need for them to take control of Cuba. Some of them even put it in the terms of, it is necessary for the survival of the United States. And Ben Franklin at some point said that Cuba is a result of the position of dirt by the Mississippi River in the Caribbean Basin. So by right, natural right, it should be part of the United States in the very early times of the Republic, which of course is not true. Yeah, that's not true, by the way, not true. But that was a way in which he was trying to provide a scientific basis for this aspiration. So, from that point of view, taking control of Cuba or retaining control of Cuba, or in the most recent times, retaking control of Cuba, have been a fundamental component there, because it's just too important from a geopolitical point of view. And therefore, these policies have been justified through based on a number of different reasons. For a long time, it was very bluntly the need of acquiring Cuba or the need of retaining Cuba, but more recently, after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, as it was in the midst of the Cold War, then it was a threat of communism in the Western Hemisphere what served as a justification for these policies. And when that idea lost currency back in the 1990s, then it was replaced by the lack of democracy, violation of human rights, support for terrorism, you name it. All of these ideas have been floated as the justification or the reason behind these policies. But however, since very early, there was a secret document that now is accessible. It was a memorandum written and signed by Lester Mallory, was the Assistant Undersecretary of State for Latin America. in the Department of State of the United States in 1960, he wrote that. He wrote essentially that the only way to destroy the legitimacy of the Cuban government, that's what it means, will be to create enough economic hardship so people would be discontent, and that will make that government, the new government of Cuba, to lose the support of the people. By the way, this is early 1960, before the nationalizations happened in Cuba, which was at the time used as a way to justify some of these policies. This is months before that. This is before Bay of Pigs, the invasion of Bay of Pigs. This is before the missile crisis. So the policy, American policy towards Cuba, it is very clear in its rationality that had very little to do with those specific events or any of the justifications have been used at different times. It is a much more structural and deep process that is rooted in this history and geopolitical component of the relation, which especially became more important when the Cuban Revolution also created some repercussions in the region, and other movements and political forces emerged that somehow changed the political landscape in the Western Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm. So about the formation of the blockade embargo. First of all, we needed to address this topic by talking about definitions, because it's very important for us, because in the United States, they always talk about embargo, and in Cuba, we talk about blockade. So we are offering right now 3 definitions of embargo and 3 definitions of blockade in the next slide. But before that, let me just say that these 6 definitions, none of them, not a single one, is from a Cuban author. So we just pick definitions from the Merriam-Webster, from the Britannica Encyclopedia, from Cambridge University, the dictionary. I mean, so that no one can say that we are using only the Cuban authors, not a single one of them. And the thing about embargo in the United States and how they use the definition is about a relationship between only 2 countries. Where the United States decides that they don't want to have any more relationships in commerce. But that leaves everything that has to do with extraterritorial measures apart. They don't talk about that. And that is part of the reality of the Cuban population and of the Cuban government. And it has been a part of the United States and Cuba relationship in history, because many other countries, Belgium has been affected by the blockade. So that is one of the reasons that we say that embargo is not enough as a term, as a definition for the reality of the Cuban case. So in the case of the blockade, there is another problem, because the term started at the London Naval Conference in 1909. So the term was at first only thought for the sea. I mean, we were talking in this case about 2 countries where United States, in this case, they don't let anything in or out of Cuba. So you can see that from the first time, they are going way far, just the commerce term. But it's also reduced because it's they only talk about the blockade at the sea part, at the naval part. So the problems with the airplanes, for example, of course, when we're looking at it, this is 1909, there was no development yet of the aviation, so as to think about this. But also, we are seeing that the blockade is also more comprehensive because it goes far away, it goes far beyond just the commerce part. But as we were saying, that there is no clear definition. That's why we use, because it's reduced when we talk about as academics. So we are using right now in Cuba, in our research center, the term of international sanctions. So, and we gave our very own definition because in the conventional definitions, they say that in order to talk about an international sanction, there has to be a crime, or the country that is sanctioned, they have been misbehaving at some point. So if you make part of the definition of those, so you're saying that Cuba is committing a crime or that Cuba is misbehaving at some point. So we are just saying in our definition, we made it more broad, that there are punitive measures imposed. They can be directly or indirectly imposed by a state, a group of states, or international organizations. But the goal is to limitate both the material capacity and the ability to act, so that the country that is sanctioned can make the changes that the sanctioner is interested in. So that is what we're doing. That is what we're using right now. And about the formation of the US blockade, we have to say that it didn't start in 1962, in February 3rd, with President Kennedy. Because if we look at history, from the very moment that the revolution triumphed in 1959, there were punitive measures in order to reduce the sugar quota. Because the United States, as we had a dependence in history, the United States, they were our very first client. So what happened? Okay, revolution triumphed. In only 3 days, the United States recognized Cuba as a sovereign state. But they started cutting, but little by little, the quota of sugar. So they just took away from us the very first product that gave us the best income that we had in Cuba at that time. And that started in 1959, since the very first month of the revolution. So we can see that we only put just the most important moments in the formation of the US blockade, starting in 1960 with President Eisenhower, just with what we were saying about the import of Cuban sugar, then with President Kennedy, and the formal proclamation, executive proclamation with what they call embargo, that we are saying that is not enough. In 1963, they said, when they applied to us the Trading with the Enemy Act, they formally are saying that Cuba is the enemy of the United States. So they're applying that law to us that forbids, is one of the pillars, if not of the fundaments of the blockade to date. And also, we have very specific legislations in 1963, and they have been modifying it for many, many times, with the Cuban Assets Control Regulations that are specific for us. And also, we have the last two in the 90s. We have to make the connection in here. In the 90s, it was the most difficult time in the history of the revolution for Cuba, because the Soviet Union was not there anymore. So that's the moment that the United States took to put these two legislations, which are in 1992, the Torricelli Act, and in 1996, the Helms-Burton Act. And they codified the blockade in such a way that there is almost not a single topic in Cuba, not even the endogenous topics like corruption, that is not embedded, that is not connected at some point with the blockade. We've tried to find ways when there is no connection with the blockade, and we haven't been able to find one, because they are so deeply embedded in the daily life of the Cuban that they cannot be disconnected. So, next.
Yeah. This is me. Okay. One of the things is that, just a comment on what you was just saying, those two laws in the 1990s, that's a moment in which the United States had a choice. The Soviet Union had disappeared. The United States was triumphant after the Cold War. This is the early times of the so-called post-Cold War. And they had a choice. They were adjusting their foreign policy, and they could decide if they will go for creating the form of approaching Cuba that will give them some level of influence by engaging in, let's say, cooperation of some sort, opening up a little bit to Cuba, so offering Cuba an opportunity to develop economic and social ties and all kinds of connection with them, so they will have a presence in Cuba. Or they could just wait that Cuba will collapse, which was essentially was expected at the time, because the Soviet Union was no longer there. Cuba had lost the 85% of foreign markets, which is critical for an economy, for a country with an economy that is dependent on this foreign trade. To have been the case for Cuba for about 300 years or so. It's nothing new. Cuba depends on its foreign trade because it is not, it doesn't have the ability to produce everything that it needs, that we need. So facing that choice, the US made the choice of trying to show Cuba even more by introducing this legislation, which of course has a lot to do with the internal political environment in the United States, the so-called New Greenish Revolution in the US, when the more radical right-wing conservative forces took control of Congress and they imposed their agenda even on President Clinton, and then they used a number of different events to justify their actions. But that connects directly to the variables and factors that drive this process of policy making. And I think, or we think, that is a number of some types of variables that we should look at. First, what we call, and this is, again, this is looking at the United States and their making of the Cuba policy, okay? This is what we call the contextual variables. So the ways in which the context is behaving, or the different actors and forces in that context are behaving, and therefore the way in which these are addressed by the United States. In first, here we have to consider for the United States that the situation inside Cuba, it is fundamental. The way in which they perceive the situation in Cuba, because there is a difference between the reality and the perception of reality, okay? They typically look at two very deeply connected factors, as we actually saw from the beginning. One is the state of the Cuban economy, obviously, and then the level of support for the government. For them, those are, and obviously those are deeply connected, interdependent, largely. And also, they look, and we need to also look at the state of the international system at large. Again, the United States, being a global power and being the dominant power for so long, its decisions for anything that have to do with foreign policy are largely influenced by the balance of power in the international system, are largely influenced by the way in which they perceived their position within that international system. In the 1990s, the United States was triumphant. There was considered the sole power. A unipolar system had emerged from the Cold War, from the ashes of the Cold War. And then in the 21st century, things began to change with the emergence of China and the return of Russia as an important power, the emergence of other regional powers that had the ability, and still today have the ability, to act independently from US preferences, and even in spite of US preferences. I'm thinking, for example, in Iran, which is a regional power in itself, or in the Southeast Asia, you have Vietnam and other regional powers. And if we look at the Americas, which is very important in itself, then we need to understand also that the process in Cuba is an integral part of the political evolution of the region. And for the last 20, 25 years, we have observed a very dynamic reality, political reality in the region. The pink tide, the return of right-wing governments, and the return of some left-leaning governments, or some new left-leaning governments in the region, which show a level of fluidity in the political landscape in the region that is fundamental to understand, because Cuba is at the very center of all of that, as cooperating with those forces, and also serving to some of them as an example for the good or for the bad. Because for many right-wing forces, they use Cuba as, we will say in Cuba, el coco, the boogeyman. Say, okay, if you vote for these people, they will make this, whichever country that may be, they will make it a new Cuba. And more recently, a new Venezuela as well. So it is part of that. So when they look at Cuba more recently, this is what they see. I think that I don't need to explain too much. This is a Cuban economy, real GDP, which we prefer to use real GDP than current GDP for obvious reasons. I think that the dip is really evident. This is the pandemic, by the way. It had begun to slowed down before the pandemic, but with the pandemic, it essentially crashed. Like essentially everybody, but our contraction was much deeper than in other countries because we also have the blockade or the embargo or the sanctions, the system of sanctions, and so on. Also, as we were talking, international system, it is very different from what it was in the 1990s. When you take these two together, the US needs in that context to reinforce its presence in the region and try to fight back against these changes in the region, because those are undermining the power structure they had created back in the time, as Cuba did, yes, in 1959, and Nicaragua did later in 1979, but now it's probably more widespread than before, and still Cuba is still being part of the process. So we have to put it also within that framework to actually understand what is happening. And the other variable, the other set of variables that I think is extremely important is what it is called the domestic variables within the United States. I will just mention them very quickly. They have to do with the balance of power within the country, different interest groups that may have some specific interest on the case of Cuba. It is very clear that the preferences and the orientation of the executive is very important. If we look at the cases, for example, of Obama and Trump, and we see the behavior of domestic actors, you can see that there is a coincidence between the ability of those domestic actors to have an influence on the process that is proportional to the way of convergence of coincidence with the line of the executive. Sorry. And within that framework, then we need to look at electoral politics. In particular, the role of the Cuban American community, which I, by the way, always use quotation marks for the Cuban part of that, especially for the last year or so. Because last year, there was a number of them who signed for a petition asking for a military invasion of Cuba, of their own country. And then I have a problem with accepting that as a Cuban attitude. You see, it's like someone here in Belgium asking for an invasion to solve something. Sorry. But then the Cuban American community is, the Cuban American vote and the Cuban American elites are influential, given the importance of the state of Florida, especially in presidential elections, and how decisive it may be. Remember the case of, for example, George W. Bush in 2000. So that is another key factor, and quite often the most influential one in the decision-making process regarding the Cuba, because it's quite easy for a US president and a US politician to advance or to propose sanctions against Cuba because it is relatively low cost, politically speaking, and may have an impact in showing some part of that, especially that is within the community, that they are acting against the dictatorship in Cuba, as they put it. And last but not least, in this particular part, we also need to consider this. The United States has been using economic sanctions more often year by year. And this is the Department of the Treasury, their own account of their economic sanctions. They increased the use of economic sanctions international, and this is before Russia. This is late 2021. This is before these huge packages with Russia. They increased that the number of sanctions by 993% between 2000 and 2021. That is a huge increase, which is telling us that aside from everything else, for the United States, economic sanctions has become an everyday more frequently used weapon, what they have decided to use when other tools are no longer useful or less useful than they used to be. So we have to also understand the policy towards Cuba within that particular framework.
So about the system of sanctions. In this part of our research that we're presenting here, first of all, we look outside of Cuba, we look abroad. And we chose two major global databases so as to look for the Cuban case. And of course, we look at GSDB, and you can see in there that they only reflect 10 sanctions in that period of time. And we also use EUSANT. This is the European Union sanctions database, and it's even less, but they only see 6. That is one of the reasons why we made our own database, because in Cuba, also the researchers, the professors, and even the ministries, they also studied the main points of the blockade, but no one has studied before the details of the blockade. I mean, the mapping of in detail of all of the sanctions over a period of time. So we did the first part of the map from 1996 to 2021, and we found 171. In order to get this number, we have to process more than 3,000 results, because we process everything that said Cuba in the Federal Registry and also the US Congress. So the other thing that we did in the research was also to study the flexibilizations, which is also new, because no one ever studied everything. Okay, the sanctions, but there was a point where the government did something about it. I mean, they did some flexibilizations, at least taking people out of the blacklist they did about Cuba. And this is the chart with the details in every year, with the flexibilizations and of course the sanctions in every year. You can see that only with Obama in 2015 and 2016, the flexibilizations were even broader and they were bigger than the sanctions. And you can see that our worst period in 25 years was Trump, above all 2029, with 18 sanctions. There was a time that we didn't have time to recover because there were sanctions, maybe 3 a month. So the amount of time, I mean, you in the past you had at least weeks or maybe a month just to recover and to take measures in your country to fight that sanction. But with Trump, that was just even not possible. So that was our very worst year. And as you can see, no flexibilizations at all. And with Biden, it has been no different. He has just made some flexibilizations, but he hasn't taken away all of the measures that Trump took. And so he has been adding more sanctions in time. So another thing that we did was blacklists, because that is another part, a big part of what makes Cuba so difficult to do, for example, foreign trade. And we identified 3 blacklists that the United States uses against Cuba. The first is OFAC, specially designated nationals and bloc persons. In there you can find representatives, for example, from Cuban offices abroad, or tourism offices, for example. In the other one, this is a list of restricted entities and sub-entities. And this is interesting because you can see that there is an end user review committee where there are representatives from the departments of commerce, state, defense, energy, and the treasury sometimes. And they're the ones deciding, all of these people, who comes in and who comes out of the blacklist. And this is the last one that it was introduced in 2020, thanks Trump so much. It is the Cuba prohibited accommodation list, which is kind of crazy because even the private sector is in there. This is a list of addresses and places, particular places that are in a blacklist. The United States citizens that go to Cuba, they cannot go. So imagine that a person wants to travel from the United States to Cuba with all of the restrictions, and they have to take this list on account. I cannot go here, I cannot go here, I cannot go here. So it's just is just really difficult because United States, between the Cuban American community and also the US visitors, above all with Obama, they were a very important part of the foreign visitors of our community to Cuba in those years. So they were a big part of our economy back then. So another thing that we are presenting here is another part of the story. We connected the presidential electoral years, which are also congressional electoral years, with the biggest increases in sanctions, because we wanted to see if there was a connection between the elections, presidential elections, and the increases in sanctions. And here's the result. You can see that there is a connection. It's not about if we are 11 million people in Cuba suffering with the blockade. It's not about ideology. It's also about elections. So you can see that they are near the biggest increases in time, at least in these 25 years, which is the amount of time we're still trying to get to 1959. But there is a process there. We have a student there, Melina Iturriaga. She's doing her Ph.D. and her master dissertation on those topics. And you can see that it's very near. The red lines are the presidential election years. And of course, we have in blue the sanctions. And they move, even that you can find the increases before, right in the very same year or after. So we can see in there that there is a desire, in this case, of we have to do something about the people who vote for us, or we are giving the image that we're doing something with the state of Florida. Ernesto talked about the importance of the state of Florida, or we are doing something about the compromises, about the promises we made with if the president got elected at that time. So next, this is another result that we got. These are the active blacklisted people at the end of the presidential terms. We can see that Obama, for example, he was the president that took most people out of the blacklist. And most of all, and most important of all, he took most of the foreigners, which was really important because that really damaged our foreign trade and our foreign investment in Cuba. So this was really good. But with Trump, you see that everything went backwards. This is probably, when we finish the mapping, we will see, but this is probably the biggest blacklisted moment that we had in history with Trump, with 707 people in the blacklist. So next. We have 585 sanctioned entities in Cuba, above all state-owned enterprises. I must say that state-owned enterprises in Cuba, they have the weight because they have most of the resources, and I'm not talking just about human resources, I'm talking about material resources, and most of our gross domestic product is in their shoulders. So when you are attacking our state-owned enterprises, you are attacking the very core of our economy. And if you see the figures, we have about 1,900 state-owned enterprises in Cuba. So imagine what is to have nearly a third of these enterprises in blacklists. It's almost impossible to work with people abroad, or even to get anything from abroad. And of December 2018, this is the number, and we made a comparison with the situation in China. With the 7th of June 2021, there were only 135 Chinese companies in OFAC's blacklist. Imagine China, such a big country with so many enterprises, and what is the situation with Cuba? It's just, the difference is huge, simply. Next. So we had newlies, 54.5% of new entities added, and this number includes a number of very important activities. And of course, this is the chilling effect that not many people also talk about. which is the fact that, okay, even from the moment that there is a news that there is going to be a sanction, negotiations have gone backwards. People that were for months talking that they were going to invest in Cuba, and there is a news that there is going to be a new sanction. With Trump, that happened a lot, and simply we just lost the entire negotiation. So, next, the impacts.
Yes, one comment before getting there. No, just leave it there. All of these sanctions that are in those lists that we actually found, this does not refer to fines imposed on companies. This does not refer to applications of existing sanctions. This is regulations that were introduced in the books, either to renovate, to modify existing sanctions, or to introduce new ones, because that is important to know. This is not just they just find this company or that other one. This is the regulation that allows that to happen. Because that means, and this is a very important component here about the impact, that the system of sanctions is not only broad and comprehensive, it is also changing every time. It evolves over time very quickly, and evolves in forms that are very hard to predict. And that creates something that is very, very, very important, which is uncertainty. And uncertainty is not good for business. The only businesses that thrive with uncertainty are risk capital that like to invest the least amount they can to extract as much profit as they can in the shortest possible length of time, which is not good for development to begin with. And it's not even good for economic growth. And of course, all of this means that what is called country risk, which is the indicator that is used to synthesize this kind of different challenges and risks and all of that, have been growing steadily, especially since Trump came to office. And the bulk of that country risk come from those sanctions. Even some American businessmen that were polled that we are aware of, because there are very few and typically limited studies on the subject on the American side. But some have been done, and we happen to be in touch with people that conducted these polls, these surveys of some business persons in the US, and they almost unanimously, they stated that the biggest fear in entering any kind of business with Cuba is US policies and legislation. So it is very important in that sense. What this means is a huge loss for the Cuban economy. These figures that we have is the estimate on the Cuban side. Britain has an estimate of about 120 billion. Very similar. Those are bare minimums because we cannot quantify the development that didn't happen. And this is a big part there. And all of this means that, in fact, Cuba has a lot of problems trying just to satisfy basic needs. That means that Cuba all the time have to go with a plan B. The traditional way of doing business doesn't work. We cannot operate with bank transactions. We just can't. We cannot trust any immediate traditional way of engaging in any contract with any foreign company. It may be pursued and punished right after it happened by the United States. And it's very hard to find any significantly large company in the world that doesn't have or doesn't want to have any sort of connection with the United States. And that's one part of the problem. The other part is that the US dollar is the dominant currency in international markets and international trade, and we cannot use the dollar. We just can't. In any point of a transaction, the dollar could be involved. And then you have what she was saying about the chilling effect. Companies, financial institutions that probably they will not be punished by the United States for some of their operations, but just the fact that they are not sure that they could do it more or less risk-free, they abstain from doing so, which is an additional layer of sanction that is not in the books, is this additional effect. So the consequence is shortages for the population. That's pretty much the base, the fundamental impact. Yes. This has a huge social impact because, of course, having such a limited access to basic products, basic goods, and also services, because services require some resources to be provided, that means that it generates the levels of poverty, of people vulnerable to poverty, that in Cuba, to be a poor person in Cuba is not exactly like being a poor person in most of the countries, because poor persons in Cuba still have access to a number of things that are guaranteed by the state, and that includes a minimum number of products that are distributed egalitarianly for the entire population every month, which is not enough, but it's at least something that is that allows even the poorest person to have some basic livelihood. But yet this generates poverty, especially with non-essentials, and also it contributes to generate or to reinforce the growth of inequality in Cuba. Why? Because in this context, especially with the emergence of private businesses, etc., and as people, especially the people that is not part of that private sector, have troubles having access to those goods and services, then there will be an increasing gap in the living standards, which the Cuban government have been working on trying to contain. And of course, the process actually came from a moment of a very low level of inequality back in the 1980s, one of the lowest, if not the lowest worldwide. That with the process that came afterwards, the economic crisis that followed, that in many ways we have never totally recovered from the 1990s. We have been trying to cope all the time. With the content of the sanctions, all of that have generated a break, or at least some level of fracture in social cohesion. And that means sources for social discontent and therefore potential for social conflict, which is ultimately one of the outcomes that the sanctions are actually after. So this is essentially what living in Cuba during the pandemic was, or at least for most people, the idea of making the very long colas, as we call it, queuing to buy stuff. It is interesting because this is a combination of the shortage and the need to distribute in a way that will be accessible to all. So there won't be abundance of anything anywhere. But at the same time, there will be some level of guarantee that people will access some of products will not be part of that. And at the same time, people in these critical situations, they tend to behave differently. Nervous purchases, and people buy more than what they need just to secure stockpiling before something happening and they will not be accessible. So it makes it even more difficult to secure distribution and access. But this is something that's last year, if I'm correct. So all of these have also the political impacts. Why? Because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. The blockade is part of a broader policy that includes, for example, the support for opposition groups within Cuba or even more so outside Cuba, that receive funding coming from the United States. And this is not, the CIA gave black money to some people. No. The United States federal budget have a $20 to $30 million every year that are appropriated to support or to fund programs for the development of democracy in Cuba. That's the way in which they frame it. And then they are funneled through NGOs, especially National Endowment for Democracy, which is an NGO in name only, if you ask me, and USAID, same case. And these are millions that go, for example, to media outlets, independent media outlets, that they get money with very specific aims. For example, to denounce, and this is the wording that is in the website of USAID as in October 2021, when they were given in total about $7 million to a number of projects. The aim is to denounce violations of human rights in Cuba. Now, I won't even get into if those violations happen or not. But when you are giving money to denounce violations of human rights, it's not the same as saying to show to the world the situation of human rights in Cuba. Your goal is to denounce violations of human rights, whether they exist or not. That outlet have a vested interest in denouncing those. And this happens across the board in those different media outlets. All groups within Cuba that have organized demonstrations against the government, from the Ladies in White to 27th of November as a group that was formed in late 2020, and so on, and so on, and so on. And many of the leaders of these organizations have been trained in the US, in Spain, in Argentina, in programs that are designated specifically to form leaders for Cuba, younger leaders for Cuba within that particular framework. All of this is to say that at the eyes of the Cuban government, all these different groups are not genuine opposition groups. Those are groups at the service of a foreign power that happens to be the biggest threat for Cuban national security. So they are perceived, and most likely many of them at the very least are threats for Cuban national security, for Cuba's sovereignty. So that in itself, it limits the political debate that can be allowed in Cuba in that context. I'm not even saying that it's good or bad. This is an immediate outcome of this particular set of policy and this particular behavior, which also applies to the flows of information and the freedom of speech in Cuba. Yes, there is freedom of speech guaranteed in the Constitution, but then you also have a limit. There is not full free speech actually in reality anywhere. In the case of Cuba, this is limited by one fundamental factor, one fundamental component, which is you can say whatever you want. What you just can't do is to lie to affect the continuity or the sustainability of the Cuban political and social and economic model. So that's the basic idea. And one of the problems is that in many of those information flows, there is a lot of fake news that I use, which is interesting because there are a lot of things in Cuba that I could criticize right now. But quite often, they just don't ring bells for people outside Cuba, because quite often this is directed to counterparts outside Cuba. So they often either distort or just invent news altogether. And we can see just recently with the accident in the Saratoga Hotel in Havana, they began to say, oh, this was done by the government as a way to, I don't know, whatever, and so on and so on and so on. And of course, one part of that is also going directly to the Cuban people, especially on using the media platforms, the digital media platforms, from Facebook to WhatsApp to, which is the most commonly, those are the two most commonly used in Cuba, and to the created groups that really were, for example, for trading stuff. And then in certain conditions, they began to distribute some messages. And one very important outcome of all of this, the crisis plus this stimulation of this content and the hashtags that circulated in those times, this is in the midst of the pandemic, were the protest demonstrations of July 11th or the 11th of July 2021 that were very well known and also misrepresented, because it's common to find in media that were the demonstrations that began on July 11th. And a more accurate way of depicting will be the demonstrations of July 11th. It's not like we have been month and month and month in massive demonstration. That didn't happen. It was a massive demonstration that day, and there was also a massive counter-demonstration in support of the government that is very seldom presented in media. Even Fox News, I love them. What can I say? Fox News, they publish pictures, but then they blur the signs, because the pictures they had were people that were actually supporting the government. They just blurred the signs so they could present them as protesters. It is that kind of manipulation that happened out there. I'm not saying that these demonstrators didn't have authentic, legit basis. They did, definitely. But they were largely stimulated by all these campaigns, but also the conditions that led to that protest, the pandemic, but even more so, the economic crisis, are largely provoked and worsened worsened by the blockade or the sanctions, the embargo, whatever you want to call it. I don't care. I personally don't care how you call it. What I care is about the content and what it actually means. So this is last slide, almost last slide. Some conclusions about it. I think it's very clear that the reason for the continuity and reinforcement of the sanctions, the blockade, embargo, is a combination of many different factors, from geopolitics to domestic variables to the nature of the actors involved in this. The nature of the sanctions are a problem in themselves because of the way in which they change over time, thus making way more difficult to cope with them. There is some people that say, okay, the blockade is always there, even in Cuba. So we just have to forget about that and try to operate outside the blockade. Yeah, how? Because when something is outside the blockade, next you know, that will be part of the sanctions that will introduce. Every time that there is a new, for example, project for investment, international investment funding or whatever, there will come out a sanction from the United States banning Cuba from being part of that project. It doesn't matter if it is a World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank or any other thing, any other institution that the US is part of, especially when it is a major part of. And all of this, it is visible not only in these obviously exogenous factors, it is also part of, as you were saying earlier, of what is typically considered endogenous problems, like for example, corruption. The blockade creates opportunity and incentive. If a person if we cannot make a transfer, the government cannot make I'm not even talking about the government. No one in Cuba can operate a foreign account from Cuba. This goes from governmental institutions to NGOs to private citizens. In many places, for example, private citizens in Mexico, for example, there's only one bank that open accounts for Cuban persons, Cuban citizens, regardless of the migratory status. They could be residents in Mexico, but most banks will not accept their as clients. They will not exchange money. I mean, people may bring a foreign currency, they will not be able to exchange it in the typical way. And this is Mexico, which is right next door. There is a lot of Cubans there, but even we were talking earlier about NGOs that operate with Cuba. They have been forced to find non-traditional or just to pull out of Cuba because they cannot operate their accounts. And some of their operations and transactions have been blocked by different, but they have lost hundreds of thousands, even millions in the total of euros or whatever other currency they use, because they are not allowed to do any kind of operation that the name Cuba or anything related to Cuba appears. And that is very important to understand. It affects anything. And the last idea is that in spite of the recent cosmetic changes announced, and emphasis on announced, not implemented yet, there is no clear way, especially, for example, the remittances and the end of restrictions for remittances, which is very unique of Cuba, for Cuba. They lifted the limit on the remittances, but there is no clear way of how to send it legally, because the counterparts in Cuba that have to operate within the country, they are still sanctioned. That sanction was not lifted, and there is no, as far as we know, ongoing negotiation, at least public, with a counterpart in Cuba that will allow this to happen. So at this point, we're essentially the same place. It's just the effect of an announcement that yes, had some positive effects. That did happen, but the essence of the flexibilizations haven't actually become effective. And I don't see how this will change as a general trend, because even the decline of the United States as a global power probably is a way to probably will lead the United States to try to reinforce its positions in the region, and Cuba is still one of the biggest problems they have to face on a daily basis in the Western Hemisphere. So this is pretty much what we have. Thank you so much. And after this, if you're interested, it's there. We have a list of some the things we have published in the last few years that are connected to this. So if anyone is interested, something.